So I'm a bit hesitant to say it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker for obvious reasons of what Eric was saying before. But nonetheless, we're very excited that Robyn is here with us today. She is Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor in the discipline of Political Science, the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne. And she's a fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia since 2007. She has published widely in the fields of environmental politics, political theory, and international relations, with a special focus on the ethics, politics, and the governance of climate change. In 2019, she received a Distinguished Scholar Award from the Environmental Studies section, ESS, of the International Studies Association. And we're also very excited to have her here, as we also chose to translate one of her books. Andrej Lukšić previously mentioned in the morning that we do some book translations, and Eckersley's Green State is one of those books. And to my understanding, she will delve a bit into that, but she will also delve into the climate emergency and also latch on to some things that Eric said earlier, and maybe even produce some productive tension there. I joked earlier that I think all participants here need an Eric on one shoulder and Robyn on another, and I hope we can deliver that today.
Well, thank you very much, Rock, and to the rest of the organising team for such a great job. It's my first time in Slovenia and I'm loving it. Eric, I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation this morning, but there's two things I'd like to push back gently on with you. The first was your rejection of environmental justice and thinking of justice as something that's bestowed on others. So I'm going to challenge that claim. And I know you're not a fan of apocalyptic thinking, and you don't think fear is very productive in politics. Well, I'm going to push back a little bit there and say a little bit of fear is a good thing. It can actually mobilize. And there's actually things out there to be scared of. So with that behind me, what I want to do today is briefly reprise the Green State Project and unpack for you some of its foundations and the context in which those ideas arose, because the context has changed hugely. And so that project keeps evolving. I often think of the metaphor of think of the state as a ship that's at sea. We can't start from the beginning. We're stuck with states. They're horrible things. So we have to rebuild the ship while still at sea, bit by bit, and trying to keep adapting it. So over time, with further and further renovation, it might become something better. That's at least the hope, because we as citizens need to act through the state to act back on us to do the sort of social transformation we need to move to a genuinely sustainable world. So environmental justice is a key theme of this particular summer school, particularly just transition. So I'm going to single that one out towards the end and look at some tensions. So in many ways, what I've done is make it difficult for myself by asking myself some very hard questions about the Green State Project. And I think the climate emergency movement forces us to ask some very hard questions. We all want to think that all good things come together all at once, but they don't in politics. So we do have to make strategic decisions. But we need all the cards on the table facing up before we can actually make those decisions. And so I want to put those cards on the table. So the Green State Project is intimately linked with environmental democracy and environmental justice, as I will argue. But the hard question I ask myself is, to what extent is that challenged by the climate emergency movement? That is, how should the Green State Project and those of us interested in ecological justice or environmental justice and ecological democracy, how should we respond? Is it a threat to the project, something that we should critique, or is it something we need to absorb? Is the climate emergency movement a movement that seeks to wants to sacrifice justice and democracy on the altar of climate protection? Is it going to usher in a climate leviathan? Or is it a new democratic innovation? Is it actually all about climate justice? So these are the questions I've set myself. I don't claim to have all the answers, and I don't think it's for any of us individually to provide those answers or impose them on others, but we need to think of an institutional design that will enable us to talk about these questions. So I think that's where this will ultimately land. Plus, because I know you've all had lunch and the blood's rushed away from your head into your stomach, I'm going to have to do something to keep your attention, because we know after about 10 minutes of speaking, you'll all wander off. So what I'm going to do is intersperse a little slideshow, an apocalyptic slideshow, Eric, somewhere in the middle of this talk to try and wake you up, because otherwise you'll probably fall asleep. Okay, so let's go. So what was the Green State Project? Well, this was a project that was born in the 1990s. Even though my book came out in 2004, most of the thinking happened in the late 90s. And the 90s were a really pivotal decade. We saw the end of the USSR. We saw Fukuyama's silly claim that history had ended. We saw the spread of democracy. We saw the continual building of the European project, and we were glimpsing a post-Westphalian international order, albeit on a regional scale. Cosmopolitan democracy was one of the new brainchilds of the late David Held. It seemed a cosmopolitan decade. Globalization was the buzzword. Everything seemed possible, but of course there were a lot of obstacles. Environmental political theory took off at that point. And John Dryzek was looking at deliberative democracy. We are friends and colleagues, mutually influencing each other. And so he wrote about the Green State, I wrote about the Green State. It's now become more of an empirical project. In my own case, what I asked myself was, what if all the dreams of environmentalists were met by states? If they took on board all the claims and demands of the state, what would this mean for the state? Not just in terms of public policy, but in the fundamental purposes and institutions of states. I also asked myself, what's wrong with liberal democracy? Why is it so bad and unable to develop a satisfactory response to the global ecological crisis? So putting these two things together, I came up with this account of the state that was an outward-looking state. It was a welfare state with significant administrative and fiscal capacity, because it had to do a lot of work. Social justice and welfare was still very much part of its brief. But it was also a state that was where the regulative ideals of liberal democracy had been expanded, not obliterated, but expanded to include ecological democracy. And in a way that made it more institutionally predisposed to serving generalizable interests, particularly global environmental protection. Now, I won't have time to talk about all the details of that. But what I will want to do is unpack those regulative ideals of ecological democracy and highlight the intimate linkages between those and environmental justice, because that's kind of the foil or the background that I want to keep in mind to see if that project and those ideals is challenged by the climate emergency movement. So the ecological critique of liberal democracy was one that partly answered what I call the paradox of environmental governance. And the paradox runs like this. Since the 60s, but particularly since the first Earth Summit, and particularly since 1992, the major Earth Summit at Rio, we've seen environmental issues move from the periphery of politics to the center of politics. We've seen a proliferation of multilateral environmental treaties. We've seen a growth in environmental legislation policy. We've seen growing environmental concern. We've seen new green parties. We've seen all sorts of things. And yet, the most serious and irreversible global environmental problems are getting worse, particularly biodiversity loss and climate change. Why? Well, obviously, it's capitalism stupid is one of the answers. But the other answer, it's liberal democracy stupid, in the sense that liberal democracies are not that different to capitalist firms. They privatize gains and they socialize costs. They're institutionally designed to only think in electoral cycles, which are quite short term. They're often captured by industry interests. There's a whole lot that shows how they behave in a way that's just not conducive. They're not predisposed to protecting long-range generalizable concerns. And that's just the beginning. I mean, there's more traditional critiques of liberal democracy that I could go through, but I just want to just briefly sketch it for now. So ecological democracy was based on a basic ambit claim that all those affected by serious and irreversible ecological risks should be entitled to participate in the decisions or otherwise be represented in the decision-making and policy-making process. So I call it a kind of all affected principle. Now, of course, future generations can't be present, non-human species can't be present, citizens of other countries can't be present. But the ambit claim of ecological democracy said, let's discuss these decisions as if they were all present, as if we had to answer to them. And that was a simple move, a very simple move. And it was based on a kind of intuition that if those engaged in risk-generating decisions, particularly corporations, but not only, had all the so-called negative ecological side effects of their decisions all captured, concentrated, and beamed back down on them, they wouldn't do it. They just wouldn't do it, right? So this is a way of trying to create that environment where they have to answer directly to those to whom they're doing it. And so that was the kernel of the idea. So what I tried to do was think of institutional innovations that would bring all those neglected ecological constituencies into view in our deliberation and decision-making. And of course, it presupposed a deliberative exchange rather than crude bargaining, where everyone else's preference is a constraint against which you can realize yours. And that in itself was a big ask. And you might say, well, that's a bit of a fantasy. Well, it's designed as a critical counterfactual ideal in the same way that Habermas's discourse ethic, which focuses on trying to free up the communicative context for democracy to work, works as a counterfactual ideal. We're never going to get to that ideal, but boy, we need it, because whenever we criticize something, we presuppose some better alternative. And without that, how can we even engage in the business of critique? We already see many constitutions, including environmental rights protection. We see environmental due process protection. We see commissions for the future being set up. And we also see the precautionary principle, which is a decision rule that says if there's any a plausible case for serious or irreversible risks being generated by this decision, then we should wait rather than say, oh, we don't know. Use uncertainty as a reason for not acting. And in a sense, the precautionary principle is like a proxy form of representation for future generations and those that can't be represented. So we really do need to find ways to represent the unrepresented in democracy. At the same time, my thinking over time has actually shown that liberal democracy is an emperor with no clothes. I don't know if any of you are aware of the democratic paradox in democratic political theory. The democratic paradox runs something like this, that it's called the boundary problem in political theory. The thing about political communities that claim to be democratic is the boundaries, the territorial and citizenship boundaries of those communities, or the territorial one, was never decided democratically. And in fact, you can't decide that democratically because it presupposes a demos, that is a democratic community in the first place, but that's the very thing that needs to be delineated. Can you see my problem? The only way to solve the boundary problem in democratic theory is to include everyone on Earth. And only then, but that's impossible. We can't all deliberate and determine those boundaries. But in the end, the point is that the borders of our democratic polities, such as they are, have never been justified democratically, which is all the more reason to exercise ecological democracy and make decisions as if all those others who were excluded in undemocratic ways, usually by colonization, conquest, wars. There's a few boundaries that have been negotiated, but most of them haven't. I think once we expose that, then I really do think the liberal democratic emperor has no clothes. So how does ecological democracy relate to environmental justice? Well, my answer is intimately. It's not just a procedure. It rests on a particular deontological or Kantian conception of justice that not only all humans are ends in themselves, but all beings. So all beings should be entered into Kant's kingdom of ends. All beings are entitled to their own autonomy and to enjoy their own modes of flourishing. And I'm talking about a lot of incommensurability here. It's very hard to find the language that doesn't fall back on invidious comparison between humans and non-human others. Now, in environmental justice theory, if I think of my good friend and colleague, David Schlossberg, he's employed what are justice concepts that derive from the critical theory of the Frankfurt School. 3 principles of justice. Recognition, who belongs, who do we recognize as members of our polity, deserving of justice. 2, he called it participation, I call it procedural justice. The justice of how we discuss and decide how to act together. 3, distribution. What is the pattern of distribution of goods and bads and so forth? Are they fair? And also the results of our policy decisions, the distributive consequences. Now, of course, in critical theories of justice, Iris Marion Young pioneered the critique of what she called the distributive paradigm, as if justice is just about distributing things. And she quite rightly rejected it and said, we need to look at the background justice, not just the distribution, but the production and generation of these things. And Robyn Eckersley, in her work on just responsibility, said that's what injustice itself is. It is power disparities in our social structures that produce a very skewed distribution of goods and bads. Wealth, income, opportunity, pollution, risks, you name it. Health, cultural capital, all sorts of things. So don't reduce everything to things to be distributed. Think of the generation of these problems and the social structures that contribute to that. And that's why climate justice can only really be thought about as a structural injustice, and the distributive patterns, and maybe this is where I do agree with you, Eric, are the symptoms of that, those unjust power relations. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that we don't have social hierarchy. We can think of all sorts of different institutions where there's an imbalance in power. We can think of the parent and the child. We can think of the student, the teacher, the professor, and the student. We can think of the capitalist owner of the means of production and the wage earner, and we can think of slavery. Now, the latter two are inherently unjust, whereas the imbalance in power in the others is actually designed, it's a trustee guardianship role that's designed to empower those with the lesser power or the lesser knowledge. But that power can be abused, and when it is, things can go terribly awry. So having that imbalance of power is not always a bad thing. It depends on the nature of the social structure, but some, as Marx argued, and I have to agree, that capitalism is fundamentally unjust in its relationship, in its class relations. And this, but it's not the only cause of this skewed distribution of environmental risks, because that's what ecological democracy was designed to bring into view and to try and avert or turn around. So if we go back to those 3 principles of justice, which Nancy Fraser calls recognition, representation, and distribution, or as a demand, it's recognition, representation, and redistribution via changing social structures. When we look at environmental justice movements generally and climate justice movements in particular, they're all picking up on these. Now, some of you may be aware of the big debate between Axel Honneth and Nancy Fraser over which of these principles is the most important. For Axel Honneth, the most fundamental injustice is misrecognition or non-recognition, to be not seen, to be rendered invisible and not morally worthy. For Nancy Fraser, it's distribution, or rather it's economic inequality, a point that Eric was labouring. Now, Honneth got his inspiration from Hegel. Hegel was all about recognition. Fraser got her inspiration from Marx. I'm going to suggest here, this is a bold claim, that ecological democracy is the media between these 2 justice claims, because it provides the how. It provides the institutional mechanism for making decisions, collective decisions about recognition and distribution. And it's a form of procedural justice, and it sort of links those other 2. But when we turn to look at environmental justice movements, we see that many of them are mainly claims of recognition, but they're linked to unjust patterns of distribution. So if we bring in Greta to the conversation again, she's speaking for disenfranchised youth and also for future generations who are not formally represented in legislatures. Extinction Rebellion is talking on behalf of species. There are aid development groups who work with developing countries in the international climate negotiations to look at historical injustices and There are those political ecologists who've drawn on neo-Marxist dependency theory and ecological economics to point out not only unequal economic exchange, which is the legacy of the colonial era, where we have a world divided into early and late developers, and the early developers have had this huge advantage and have unjustly enriched themselves at the expense of the later developers. They've also added an ecological dimension to that, which they call unequal ecological exchange. And so the environmental historian Alfred Crosby has shown how when the so-called conquistadors and others went to new worlds, they not only colonized people, but they colonized environment. They brought their seeds, their animals, their tools. There was exchange of species and diseases. So there was a kind of form of ecological colonization, but sometimes it's referred to as unequal load displacement, because we exported our waste to developing countries until the Basel Convention came into place. So there's very unequal systemic relations that have helped explain the vastly skewed distribution of wealth, privilege, and vulnerability. But it's not a distribution of vulnerability, it's a production of vulnerability. So all of these, I think, tie up nicely with a little bow around it in terms of analytically parsing all the different claims made by environmental justice movements. So we can think of the climate justice movements have also tried to become more intersectional. So for example, we see this with, actually I just want to backtrack. There was a thought I wanted to make about procedural justice. The word justice and justify have a common root, right? So what I'm talking about here when I talk about ecological democracy are the relations of justification. So this is a form of procedural justice, and those relations of justification call on any interlocutor in a debate to justify the rightness of something to others. By rightness, I mean normative validity, because you can't talk about the truth of normative claims. It's a category error. Things are either more or less appropriate or wrong morally, but there's no truth with a capital T in terms of something you can prove, externally validate. It can only be internally validated within a given communicative context. So the relations of justification, I think, are very important here. So it's about advocacy. Advocacy is about persuading, justifying to others. So the climate justice movement is doing that. And in its advocacy, in order to expand its audience and the receptivity of its claims, and also to its own sense of justice, it's becoming more intersectional. Even some of the most staid and longest serving environmental organizations in the US, like the Sierra Club, under their new management, have now funneled money to Black Lives Matter and showing up for racial justice. And the Sunrise Movement, for example, is very much working with the Black Lives Matter movement. And of course, environmental justice movement was a really big thing in America. It emerged primarily over the vastly skewed distribution of toxic waste sites in America, all of which ended up in Black communities. And so Robert Bullard, a key theorist, pioneer in the area, started to expose this. There's now an environmental justice atlas where we see those living along the sites of extraction, production, and waste, other zones of sacrifice in global commodity chains. So there's a spatial dimension to it as well. So climate justice intersectionality is important because it's not only making sure that they're pursuing their aims in a way that keeping others into view, but it's also building its support base, because we need broad-based coalitions to succeed politically. And then, of course, there's the just transition movement, which has primarily been about looking after those affected. Remember the all affected principle, those who are most affected by the transition away from fossil fuels. And these communities are not necessarily communities that have had climate change or environmental problems front and center in their mind, but nonetheless, it's seeing their kind of the sacrificial lambs, as it were, for the transition process. So we should look after them. We should develop new community regional development programs, hopefully having them in place and up and running at the time of the transition so they can step across rather than have to step onto some kind of monetary compensation and lose their identity. The International Labour Organization already has well-developed principles of just transition, and we already see some of these institutions developing, where you've got ministries for ecological transition, or they might be local or regional, like in the La Trobe Valley in the state of Victoria, where I live. We have an authority run by community people that are looking after that. It's probably the best example in Australia of a just transition institution. So these things do need to be institutionalized to happen because you need money, and the state, different levels of governance, has that fiscal wherewithal to be able to ensure a smooth transition and therefore to make it politically legitimate for those who wouldn't otherwise be interested. Okay, so now I want to bring in the challenge of the climate emergency movement. Before I do, though, I want to talk about the critical decade because this is what's pretty much prompted this movement. So I did describe the context in which the Green State project emerged. Well, we all know those days have changed terribly. Instead of democracy expanding and consolidating, we've seen it shrinking and deconsolidating and going terribly awry. We see the rise of nativist right-wing populism, which is the opposite of the kind of cosmopolitan sentiment that informed thinking about the Green State. We've seen a global financial crisis and we've seen a pandemic, and states are heavily indebted. And the administrative capacity has declined under what I call neoliberalism. So the state's been run down, whereas we need to build it up because it's the people's institution to act together through themselves, back on themselves, so they look after each other. All of these things, we're in a very worse place than we were when these possibilities were glimpsed nearly 30 years ago now. Enter the climate emergency movement because it's bringing into view something that's time critical. So for critical thinkers, to think about time critical problems is quite a challenge. It's quite uncomfortable to do that because it's two types of critical. One is critical as in looking at the present and why we're not getting where we need to be. The other is a critical time period within which you need to act if you're going to even address one of the most serious and irreversible problems that humans have ever faced, namely climate disruption. And it's better to call climate change climate disruption. It's better to call global warming global heating because I think they better convey what we're dealing with here. So while it's true that the Paris Agreement of 2015 was a diplomatic breakthrough, because in diplomatic language, a conference can only ever be one of two things, successful or very successful. And this was very successful, and I was there, and it was extraordinary. We got drunk celebrating because we'd been watching Groundhog Day ever since 1992. This was a big thing. But it got there by sidestepping disagreement over burden sharing and outsourcing the decision about mitigation ambition and what climate justice means to the national level. Now, although some countries have stepped up their nationally determined contributions, we're still overshooting 2 degrees. And we know that 1.5 degrees is already too hot for the roughly 48 countries that belong to the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which looks after roughly 1.2 billion people who are on the real tough edge of climate impacts. So 1.5 degrees is too hot, and we're nowhere near that at the moment. Now, the most recent IPCC's report, this is the 6th assessment report of 2021, says that global emissions have to peak no later than 2025 and fall drastically after 2030 to have only a 50% chance of reaching that temperature range. Would you get in a plane if you knew you had a 50% chance of falling out of the sky? I know I wouldn't. So that's where we're at. But not only that, the more critical Earth system scientists have questioned some of the rosy assumptions upon which IPCC reports are based. And they say that we're actually on a pathway to a hothouse Earth, even with that temperature range of 1.5 to 2 degrees. In fact, to quote a piece put together by 16 very well-known Earth system scientists, that even their stabilized Earth pathway steers the Earth system away from its current trajectory towards a threshold, oh, sorry, wrong quote here. A stabilized Earth will likely be warmer than any other time over the last 800,000 years. So in the new millennium, we're certainly seeing the impacts of this. So this is the time where some of you are nodding off. So I think it's time for a bit of a slideshow. before we start talking about the movement. Right, so I'm just going to tell you a story from home. Thanks. We've lived with fires and floods in Australia for as long as, well, Indigenous people have been here, but particularly since Australia was colonised by the British, because we've changed the pattern of land use. So fires have become much bigger and more spectacular. And of course, that's now egged on by climate change. In 2019 to 2020, Australia experienced the longest period of fires, which is now known as the Black Summer. And this is a picture, a satellite picture taken in January in 2020, and they were the fires that were taking place across the continent in 1 week. And you can see where it's concentrated in the bottom southeastern area, that's near the border of New South Wales and Victoria. And so this is now an aerial photo. The fires were so big, they created their own weather pattern. They were absolutely monstrous. So much so that the entire southeastern part of the continent was blanketed in smoke. That's Melbourne. In December, before the fires had reached their peak, you can just see the outlines of the Sydney Harbour Bridge in December. This is Parliament House in Canberra. Right across the country, it was unsafe to breathe outdoors. There were around 3 billion animals were killed or seriously injured or displaced in the fires. There was a lot of rescue of animals as well as humans in these fires. I won't go through all the statistics, but well, I will just mention that the area of land that was burned is roughly the size of the British Isles. So slightly, a little bit smaller than Turkey. That's the area of land that we're talking about. That was just one long summer because it went for many, many months. Now, I just have to throw this in. I did mention this to Eric and others last night, but our Prime Minister, who's known for bringing a lump of coal into our Parliament, holding it up and saying, "This is coal, don't be afraid," decided to go on a holiday to Hawaii during the fires. It did not go down well. And so when he didn't even tell the country he was leaving the country. He didn't tell anyone he was leaving the country. So this is one of the reasons he lost the recent election, I hasten to add. When he returned and he'd go to some of the affected areas, people refused to shake his hand. And there was this palpable sense that governments weren't protecting us. Their basic duty is to protect their citizens, and they were not doing this. In fact, they were egging on the very thing that was causing mega fires of this kind. Of course, this year, we've now had mega floods in Queensland and northern New South Wales, and this is the town of Lismore. And again, it took nearly 3 days for emergency services to come. And so there was a huge amount of mutual aid in rescuing folk. So I'm just going to that's the last slide. I just wanted to talk about this because I want to talk about emergency in two senses. Classically, an emergency is an acute situation where rapid action is required to prevent some kind of disaster befalling us, death, radical impairment. We often, in medical analogies, talk about chronic versus acute problems. So an emergency is often thought as acute. But what the climate emergency movement is splitting the sense of the time window in which action happens and when the more acute effects are realized. So this is a drawing on Ross Mittiger's passing of the idea of emergency. He said we need to think about emergency of effects. So what we just saw there were effects of climate change or climate disruption, clearly disrupting many people, many animals, and an emergency response, or one that was a bit slow, particularly in the case of the floods. And then there's emergency action. Normally that's mapped on to the emergency effect in real time. But the problem here is we've got a lag between the window of time, that's the critical window, this decade, where most of the effort really needs to happen if we're going to even reach that temperature target of the Paris Agreement, and the more distant effects that will be visited on others through space and time. And so they're playing around with emergency in that way. We hear Greta Thunberg say, our house is on fire. Well, it was for many Australians for a short period, and it will be again and again and again with increasing rapidity and ferocity. But there'll be periods when it's not. And people think, well, we're not in emergency mode anymore. But then that second idea of emergency is the idea of action happening before. Because the best way to respond to emergencies is to prevent them. So let's return to let's now turn to the climate emergency movement. It is a response to this challenge. Obviously, it arose before Black Summer, but Black Summer is just one further indication of what the response is to, or what it's about. The idea of a climate emergency actually arose in Melbourne in a book published by David Spratt and Philip Sutton called Climate Code Red, The Case for Emergency Action. And they went on to form this institute, and they've organised a number of people's climate emergency rallies in Melbourne. The first climate emergency declaration happened in Darebin City Council in 2016. So it's maybe a bit of a Melbourne thing, which is why I'm writing about it. Maybe it's not really prevalent in your jurisdiction, which is fine. But there are some state parliaments and some subnational ones, but more at the local level, you've seen climate emergency declarations, which I don't see, they're really just a statement saying, we care about this and we realise we should get a hurry up and start responding. Nonetheless, I think there are good reasons to be very suspicious of emergency claims. Very good reasons. It has a sordid history. And so we need to look at the movement critically, but we need to do it empirically rather than generically. And so I'm going to start by looking at the criticisms of the movement. I'm going to argue that they miss their mark because they're not empirically informed. So the criticisms, and it's good to trot out the criticisms, because what it does, it makes us alert to what could happen. And while we always need to be on our guard when we're talking about emergency. So there are those that say it's a securitization move, a move to sort of move beyond normal democratic politics and suspend it, or what's often called a Schmittian state of exception. We can all think of Hitler and the Reichstag fire, which was a pretext for suspending civil and political liberties in what was to become Nazi Germany. Some see it as a weapon of the powerful. It's something that's usually trotted out by the security establishment and something that shouldn't be trusted because it's used as a substitute for political justification. It breaks down what I'm calling here the relations of justification. It appeals to sovereignty and strong leadership. It appeals to fear rather than our better selves. It's based on a Christian eschatology of imminent end of time. It plays into the hands of technocratic elites or the scientific priesthood. It doesn't recognize vernacular knowledge or indigenous knowledge. It simplifies the complexity of climate change by converting everything to a single metric of carbon. We have to reach a certain target at a certain time and everything is suspended until we get to that point, but it's an indefinite period of time, all very dangerous. It's a return to high modernism, the idea of progress based on the rational application of science to the management of populations, a form of climate governmentality. It's mainly a white movement, doesn't pay much attention to the diversity of peoples or environments. It suspends thinking for action. It's an affront to justice and ultimate and to legitimate government. And I can think of all sorts of cases where emergency politics and emergency declarations have worked in this way. So the question is, do any of those critiques of emergency politics, and many of these have actually been written against the climate emergency movement, and the person who's sort of rounded up many, if not all of these, has been Mike Hume. And so the first point I'd like to say is that Mike Hume in particular has failed to notice that this is a civil society movement. It's not coming from the state. It's a really important point. The critiques don't acknowledge the ecological deficits of liberal democracy. They don't propose anything else. They just critique this and say, not that way. And that's pretty much all the same. They do not look at the context, the historical context and the political context in which this movement has emerged. So if Extinction Rebellion say, tell the truth, that can, to me, only make sense in the context of climate denialism, delay, dissembling, and post-truth politics, which we've had plenty of in Australia, certainly in the US and the UK. There's something about the Anglosphere that seems to be the worst offenders here, particularly those with a fossil fuel history. It's no accident. So these are contextually relevant. I mean, they're in relation to the times. They wouldn't have been relevant at all in the 90s. We all knew that climate change was serious and irreversible. No one really fixated on the time critical nature of the problem. But when time starts to run out, you start to worry about it. It's also assumes that emergency claims have an inner logic, and that logic's necessarily dangerous. But Jennifer Rubinstein, who's done some interesting work on international aid, where she's critiqued emergency aid versus regular overseas development assistance, because it neglects all that chronic poverty as if it doesn't matter and you only throw your money at something that's emergency. And I take her point in the context of what she's looking at. However, she's also quite rightly used Mike Saywit's claims, this idea of representative claims, that an emergency claim is just that, it's a claim. And it needs to be redeemed by relations of justification, as I would call them, and it stands or sinks to the extent to which audiences accept it. And if it's accepted, it becomes politically legitimate, provided it's not confected. And often in politics, you see governments hiding behind this in the national interest, as if that's an argument, or this is a national security matter. It takes away, it robs citizens of relations of justification. So you need to keep those relations of justification alive. And if they are alive and working well, a claim is made and it's accepted, it depends what it is, of course, then we have legitimate emergency politics or emergency claims, as it were. So here, if the argument is about emergency action now to minimize the emergency effects further down the line, there's that disjuncture. So there's a kind of creativity in using what we traditionally understand an emergency to be. The argument that it's about action, not talk, doesn't make any sense in this particular type of emergency claim making, because we know in a normal emergency, like in an operation where someone's going to die if the surgeons don't operate quickly, or a fire or a rescue situation, you have trained people who have got practices that have been built up over lots and lots of years based on practice and deliberation. And if something goes wrong, there's a post-mortem, as it were, hopefully not with the person on the operating table. And you say, well, this didn't work well. How can we make it work better? So deliberation happens before and after, but not during, when it's an acute emergency. But when it's chronic, the case we have now, then there's plenty of time for talk. If it's a critical decade, a decade's a long time to have deep discussions. So it's not like it's action and not talk. Andreas Malm says climate change is a chronic emergency, and it's because it's chronic that it's given the fossil fuel industry a lot of time to get organized, and deny and deflect. So for global heating, he says, not for global sickening, which is COVID. So I think a lot of the arguments don't stick. So I'll finish by just rounding up what these claims are and what it means for the Green State Project. So I've read a lot of emergency claims, both on websites, in speeches, and in some of the books they've published, and Greta's speeches. And it's quite clear their first claim is simply prioritization. They're effectively saying, if we don't make climate disruption the number one public policy concern and respond, we can never solve the problem, because that's what's required. It's not something we can have a cost-benefit analysis about or use other forms of decision-making. We simply will not address the crisis in any other way but giving it priority in the here and now. It's also a climate justice claim, because it's a climate justice claim on behalf of youth, on behalf of future generations, on behalf of non-human species. So it's not pitching a claim for climate order against a claim for climate justice. It's an alternative climate justice claim, but it's forward-looking, not backward-looking. So for those who have historical injustice grievances, they may feel peeved about this. They want those satisfied, and a lot of them are standing on those grievances as a reason for not acting. Well, the climate emergency movement's not patient with that. It's forward-looking. And it's interesting because we see a split within China and the G77 in the climate negotiations, which I've been watching for a very long time. They used to work as one, but now you have the Climate Vulnerable Forum, the Alliance of Small Island States, and the African group, many, not all, joining forces with the EU against the US and China, because they're forward-looking, and China and some of the major emitters in the developing world are backward-looking, and the US is just hopeless. So we see that kind of forward-looking, backward-looking justice in tension. So there's no doubt there's a tension here, and it's a painful one. Some say emergencies can only deal with like a Band-Aid solution because they're dealing with symptoms, not causes, but the climate emergency movement is asking for transformation. They don't want politics or business as usual, as Greta says, it's just blah, blah, blah. Finally, it does privilege climate science, no doubt about it. But I see no reason why it can't be also compatible with other forms of knowledge. It's just they don't talk about that. So maybe that's a problem they need to deal with. But when it comes to climate intersectionality, and particularly just transition, we do have a clear tension between a demand for justness, inclusivity, respect for diversity and pluralism on the one hand, and timeliness, boldness, and goal achievement. There's no mistaking that. But these principles are inside the just transition movement. They're not between the climate emergency, they're not just between the climate emergency movement and the just transition movement. These are the principles of just transition. They can't all be fully achieved all at once. It's just not possible, and we need to recognize that. And so I'm putting these tensions on the table. So we have to figure out what we do from here. I think about it in the same way we think about human rights. If you think of the whole raft of human rights that have evolved since the United Nations Charter on Human Rights in 1948, which said all human rights are indivisible. And what they mean by that is that you cannot really fulfill one human right if you're not always also fulfilling others. And that's true, but it's hard to do it fully all at once. I think I would say this about the claims of the climate justice claims of the climate emergency movement and other climate justice claims that might be intentional with them. There might be historical justice claims. There might be intersectional climate justice claims. They don't all sit together, but it would be foolish to sacrifice one fully at the altar of the other. Don't sacrifice any fully. And that's how I would deal with conflicting human rights claims. It's how I think about that. But that would be me if I was in a dialogic community, because at the end of the day, it's not for me to decide. It's for us to decide collectively. So the most important thing is, how do we decide? Well, we practice ecological democracy. We practice ecological democracy as advocates by embodying it, practicing it, bringing all those unrepresented interests into view, denormalizing the politics and the business that's generating the problem, highlighting the structural character of climate injustice, proposing context-specific ways of transforming local and national economies, encouraging stakeholder discussions about how to manage intersectional climate justice. So the question that the critics of the climate emergency movement haven't asked, and I think we need to ask, is what happens if the climate justice movement, and particularly the climate emergency movement, if we now understand it as a climate justice movement, what happens if it fails? What happens to the state? Not just the Green State Project, but states as we currently know them, which are not really fit for purpose. Well, at the moment, there are very few states that include in their budget forecasts the climate damage that's going to increasingly occur, which is incalculable and uninsurable, as Ulrich Beck said of world risks. They're delocalized because the sources of generating them are many and varied and all over the place, and the effects are many and varied all over the place, albeit skewed rather. So states are going to be overwhelmed with the damage costs of climate change, which will increasingly compete against other budget items. They will gradually lose legitimacy. We will expect to see them becoming a lot more inward looking. It will be really bad news for international cooperation. We will see sinking states. We will see more failed states. The slightly richer ones will become fortress states. So in a sense, the Green State Project will die. It's barely alive now, but well, that's not quite true. Finland has just committed to net zero by 2035. So there are some states that are really out there at the moment from the climate emergency movement's point of view, but nonetheless, the Green State Project would have died way earlier than that particular process. So as Peter Christoph said, that if you understand a state by its primary preoccupation, all states will become climate states, for better or for worse, if this remains unchecked. Because although states are certainly part of the problem, we cannot solve this behind the backs of states, because they have the only institutions with the wherewithal, the fiscal ability to redistribute and deal with transition, as well as the regulatory power to regulate, tax, and actually to put some businesses literally out of business, businesses that shouldn't be operating at all. They're losing their social license to operate, but they must also lose their legal license to operate. And only states can do that. So the question that I'll leave hanging is, will the climate emergency movement and climate justice movements everywhere be able to build broader and broader based coalitions to be able to carry out the types of social transformation that are required to stop that very unappealing picture, I guess. So I'm going to finish with a little quote from Elaine Scarry, who wrote about emergency powers to use nuclear weapons. And she said that, where is it? Well, it was to the effect of, I can't find it. It was to the effect that, the best way to deal with emergency is not to have it happen. And there's plenty of time for thinking before emergency. So I guess just to summarize, I don't think we can resolve all the tensions amongst the climate justice movement that I've outlined, but we need to always bring them into view. And that's what ecological democracy is about. It's always about bringing everything into view. So I'll stop at that point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robyn, for that presentation. At this time, we're opening the floor for questions, comments. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for a very inspiring talk. I have a question, and I'm no expert in your field, but on the role of democracy or ecological democracy in relation to catering for emergencies before they occur and taking time. Particularly about the role of the agonistic element in democratic procedures. How can we square the type of democracy you advocate, with which I agree, with keeping democracy an agonistic procedure, which means, which demands both broad participation, but always keeping the power position empty or shuffling all the time. And just let me deliberate a bit, because in order to deal with emergencies, we need some form of power and hierarchy at that stage, some form of expertise. You go out, you said it, you go out, you do it, you've done it before, you know what's wrong, what's right. So how do we square the need to actually have those hierarchies and power and expertise with the demand to be truly democratical, to have the position of power and hierarchies always empty or shuffling amongst those?
No, it's a good question. I think my answer would be to make that power always absolutely conditional. So you always need lines of responsibility and accountability. So whoever occupies that position during an emergency, they will have to account for whatever happens afterwards, before some forum, some committee, some board. For example, after the Black Summer fires, we had a Royal Commission into disaster management in Australia. Disasters like that are a great learning opportunity. our government wasn't the sort that was able to really come up with anything to do that. So I think that if it can't happen before and it doesn't happen before and it can't happen during, it can certainly happen after. My worry is that if you've got these things going on all the time of different nature, different kinds, and they're intersecting all the time, where everything is, the parameters are all moving, there's a sense in which we can't even exercise agency anymore. You know, that's when it really gets bad. But when they come relatively infrequently, and you have the capacity in some ways to respond, so that it's an emergency of effects. The conversation should be, I mean, the critical conversation about emergency management is one thing, and it must be had in an agonistic way. But the real conversation, the conversation of emergency action, is what is to be done now to stop that sort of thing becoming more severe. So I think that's the thing. I mean, you think of the famous debate, or Chantal Mouffe's critique of Habermas. At the end of the day, she still came back to defend liberal democracy. It was a big critique, but she circled all the way back to really where everyone else was standing. So agonism, yes, you never, ever close off the right to critical questioning. Never, ever. Because how can we learn? That awkward question may be the very question we need to be skewered with. So I think keep that flame burning, absolutely. So I totally am with you there. But maybe during the emergency is not the best time to ask, you know, if they're trying to put the fire out, literally. That's the suspension, but it's short and it's accountable before and after.
Davor Inžindarić, I will try to take questions in English. What do you think about justice and poverty? Because I came from the region in Zasavia, where companies, strange companies and big polluters explore these people and this region only for profit. What do you think? I think that some people must have basic food, clothes, and so on, and then they can thinking about environmental problems. What is your?
Well, there's two issues in your question as I hear it. One is about the responsibility of corporations. The other is about a kind of hierarchy of needs. As to the first question, when I talk about transforming social structures, I'm not just talking about, I'm talking about not just reinvigorating democracy, to think of devices and institutional designs that can enable ecological democracy. I'm also talking about the governance of the corporation. It's designed, you know, I don't know if any of you have seen the film, The Corporation, but the basic idea behind it was if a person behaved like a corporation, they'd be a sociopath. And by that's because their exclusive duty of corporate directors to shareholders is at the expense of everything else. Some of them like to brand themselves and win a social license, but it's just all advertising. So one way to do that, and we know there's this interesting thing called shareholder activism. A lot of people are buying shares in corporations they hate and turning up and asking questions of the directors at the board meetings. A lot of environmental activists have done that in Australia. It's a really new development. It's very exciting. But it's to actually make it institutionally responsible, which it's not. And there've been experiments in stakeholder capitalism where you have, I would like to rewrite company law. I used to be a lawyer once upon a time. I would like to rewrite company law so directors not only held a duty to their shareholders to make a profit, they also held a duty to the people in whose region they operate, whether it be extracting or whatever, or producing, to the workers also. And I mean, there are experiments like Mondragon in Spain where the workers actually become shareholders, but they ended up behaving not that differently to a firm. They looked after themselves, but not beyond. But by starting to build in other lines of accountability and responsibility, you bring into view, you know, we often talk about the invisible hand. We never talk about the the invisible elbow. You know, the invisible hand allocates resources according to the price mechanism, but there's always an invisible elbow. Well, you need to stop that elbow. And the only way to do that is to bring those risks into view and to make those making the decision directly accountable to those folk or their proxies. To do that on a systematic basis would make corporations a lot more responsible and a lot less capitalist. So that would be my answer to the first question. That's a big structural redesign thing. And there's nothing, it's going to be very hard to change corporation law at the national level, but there's nothing to stop local communities inventing new economic designs and experimenting, small-scale holistic experiments. They might not work. You go back to the drawing board, you start again. If it works, you expand it up a little bit to its right scale and so forth. Lots and lots of small-scale holistic experiments. To the second question, I don't like hierarchies of needs. The idea of, I don't like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I don't like the materialist, post-materialist distinction in global values surveys and in public opinion surveys. I think it's problematic, and you know, Ronald Inglehart's work is problematic in all sorts of ways. It denies the fact that there's an environmentalism of the poor. It assumes environmental concern is a full-stomached middle-class issue when it's actually a life and death matter to many people around the world. The first tree huggers were in India, not wilderness movements in North America or Australia. And so this idea, it's really crazy to think that these concerns, and there's this new ecological materialism, which is about material flows. Where does everything come from and where does everything go? We shouldn't all know the answer to those questions. And so positioning yourself, your body, your activities in alternative flows where you can account for where everything comes from and where everything goes. So I do understand that those in particular communities where there's limited job opportunities on low incomes may not be fans of environmentalism, but in a more general sense, I don't accept that materialist, post-materialist category as if environmental concerns are post-materialist. They are very material. And we know the impacts of climate change, we just saw, are very material, but there's so many other environmental issues that have a material dimension. So let's not think of it as ethereal, it's very material. It's not just a self-actualizing need of those of us that have had our basic needs met in our childhood, as Inglehart would say. I think that's really misleading.
All right, so we'll take a question from an online participant. They say, "Hi Robyn, thanks for your presentation. My name is Henna and I'm from Australia, now studying in Norway, and had a question about Australian democracy. How can we bring climate justice to the forefront of politics and society? Given the federal election results, it seems more likely now, but do you think the Australian democratic system in its current form is able to bring about real change regarding environment and climate?"
Well, thank you, Hannah. I'm very pleased to receive that question. As you know, Hannah, we do have, it's an exciting time in Australia at the moment because we've not only seen the end of this coalition government that were full of climate deniers, we've seen a new Labor government, but most importantly, we've seen the growth in support for the Greens and also teal candidates, which are blue-green candidates that are campaigning on climate change, women's issues, and anti-corruption and integrity in government. The problem, Hannah, is that the Labor government is being very short-sighted. It's not, it could repeat what happened under the government of Kevin Rudd, who came in declaring climate change was the greatest moral challenge of our time, designed a carbon pollution reduction scheme, didn't have control of the Senate, so negotiated with the Conservative forces and totally ignored the Greens. So as a result, it was very wimpy and the Greens blocked it and were forever blamed thereafter for it not getting through. And then we had another government that came through, introduced a more modified version that lasted several years, worked a treat, and then was undone by the Conservative government that we've had ever since. So the worry is that the Greens hold the balance of power in the Senate, plus one independent. So Labor can't get anything through without them. They've got 4 Greens in the lower house, along with a big crossbench, 6 Teals, all women, which is wonderful to see. The Labor government, in my view, for this to work, has to work productively with the Teals and Greens so they can get re-elected, because the Teals are keeping the Liberals out. And that's the best, that would be the best thing for climate politics. If Labor just do their own thing and then have a big fight and create a new culture war between Labor and the Greens, it's like the Monty Python film, where you have the Liberation Front of Judea and the Judean Liberation Front fighting with each other instead of the Romans. And I think this could happen in Australian politics. But the more general question is, the voting system, which is in Australia, which is in our constitution, there's no mention of political parties, keeps those two major parties with unfair control of the parliament. They're both parties from a bygone era. They're ideologically thin and weak. They both agree with they both support the fossil fuel industry in this country, despite climate change being something Labor campaigned on, and it's improving its mitigation target and doing more about renewable energy. But it's quietly letting the gas industry and the fossil fuel export industry go forward. And I can't see anything about the parliamentary numbers at the moment, other than if the Greens start to play a blocking role, and they will be blamed and there will be a horrible, ugly battle. And that's how I think it's shaping up. So I think I would rather, if we had a PR system, this problem would have been solved ages ago, because an overwhelming majority of Australia want rapid climate action. So it's the parliamentary and political institutions and the older parties that have been holding us up for more than a decade. And unfortunately, constitutional change in Australia is very, very difficult. However, my final answer, Hannah, I would say, look subnational. 4 out of the 8 subnational governments have framework climate legislation with much stronger targets, at least 50%, much higher in the Australian Capital Territory. That's where all the action is, and Labor is just going to ride on the back of that and claim credit, which they don't deserve. So I would keep working at the subnational level, where I think it's much more productive in terms of climate politics.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Hi, thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. You're not here? Okay, good. I wanted to get back on something that you quickly mentioned, that like this mess of like, it feels like almost Christian and almost like a millenaristic, like the apocalypse is near, and maybe also this connects to what Eric was presenting this morning, of like this talking of apocalypse, of like this talking of like some imminent doom just in front of us, and therefore justifying this emergency, this like complete change of a pay path, complete system restructuring, and us having the let's say having access to that knowledge, because science is showing us, we are sure that apocalypse is the end is nigh, and I wanted to ask a bit like but this is nothing new. This is something that we see throughout history. Like again, like if we imagine it in the medieval time, then it would have been the Bible. I mean, we know the Bible was wrong, but they really believed it. We know that historical materialism was maybe wrong, and there was no proletarian revolution around the corner, but the people that believed, like really believed in the communist revolution coming. And so this, I'm getting a bit sidetracked. There is often been a claim of the end is near, the apocalypse is near, we need to restructure everything, we need to change everything. And there's always been resistance to that. And since we have seen the same discourse over and over in history, I'm asking, do we see examples of like how to reconcile these completely different worldviews, how to reconcile these completely different value sets in something which can allow us to move forward altogether this time? Thank you.
Yeah, well, yeah, look, I think insofar as the discourses take that form, they're problematic, because if they say the science has spoken, so you have to shut up, don't like that maneuver at all. The end is nigh, we must do this, that because the end is nigh, we don't have time for any more talk. I don't have any time for that either. But again, as I didn't really develop it as much as I intended, but I think we do have reasons to be fearful. The question is, when does fear become productive and when is it unproductive? I mean, I don't think the end is nigh, but that fire sure felt like an apocalypse for the people in those communities. And there's been films made about it, dramas, documentaries, it's huge in Australia. So in that sense, if you're talking to an affected member of that community, many of whom have post-traumatic stress syndrome, you wouldn't be talking like this. We know that some people do become catatonic, that fear doesn't work. So it's a question of mobilizing it in a way that, without bright-siding either. See, I have just as much problem with bright-siding in order to avoid apocalyptic rhetoric. That's even worse because it's underplaying what's at stake. So it's a fine line, I admit that. But for me, I think people are very protective. I was having a chat with Rock earlier about, actually, this was a point you made, Eric. I think it was a quote from Zizek, that he knows about climate change, but he acts as if he doesn't know. Carrie Norgard, in her book, Living in Denial, writing about a community denying climate change in Norway, was saying the same thing. But in a sense, all of us have to do that to function in the world. If all you thought about was climate change and what was going to happen, you would become a dysfunctional person. You would lose your agency in the world because you would be because worrying about world risks or worrying about what could happen in the future, and that is threatening you here now, and it's threatening your ontological security, your security of being in the world. We all need routines to get by in the world. And so in a sense, we can get caught up in them so much that we really don't care enough about politics. On the one hand, you need to shock people out of their routines, but not so much that they're catatonic and they go back into a protective cocoon. Because none of us can think about this 24/7, but we need to think about it enough to remain active, vigilant, and playing our role as active ecological citizens. So I think when I was a student at Cambridge in the 80s, I used to watch films of the nuclear holocaust. I think maybe it's me. Maybe I have joy in this, but I don't actually. I don't think reducing emissions is the answer to the meaning of life at all. Less carbon, less greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere is not my aim in life. It's not our collective aim in life. We just need to get rid of that so we can get on with more productive things. It's just something that's getting in the way of, it will increasingly get in the way of us realizing who we want to be in the world, individually and collectively. So it's really just a great big obstruction to being human. So a bit of fear, yeah, not too much. And certainly don't bright side this, it's way too serious.
We have one more question from an online participant, from Matthias Krams. Thank you very much for your presentation. You defined ecological democracy as bringing everything into view. What is the relationship between ecological democracy and the project of a green capitalist state? Do you perceive them as compatible? Or can there only be ecological democracy against the capitalist state, since it is fundamentally built on exclusion to reproduce the capitalist mode of production?
Great question, a good political economy question. Well, we know that capitalist states are functionally and fiscally dependent on capital accumulation to fund their programs. All states, if you have the most stripped down understanding of a state, Max Weber, an organization that controls people and territory, to do that, you need money. You need a security force, you need taxation. And so the dilemma of the green state is that on the one hand, you need to expand the state, its welfare functions and its environmental functions. And to do that, you remain parasitic on a capitalist system. And this is, the critical work on the green state has been wrestling with this phenomenon for some time. And I'm often asked, does the green state preside over a capitalist society? I mean, critical Marxist theorists say that state managers are trapped between the legitimation function and the accumulation function. They're always in tension. At best, they can be managed. They can only be broken by moving to a post-capitalist order. So we've got 10 years to deal with this. We have to get rid of capitalism before we do it. We all know the Jameson quote, we'll see the end of the world before we see the end of capitalism. So again, I always call on my metaphor of building the ship while still at sea. You keep disciplining it, you keep disciplining it, you keep regulating it, you put it on its knees, you change corporate law, you do all sorts of things, you close some businesses, you go to the point where it no longer is passing off its costs through space and time. And if that's still capitalism, maybe it's one that I could live with. But it's a really hard question. And these are dilemmas. And we're in a situation where states are indebted and we need to spend money to transform and to do it justly. And so it requires, it's like a chess game. You have to do so many things with each move. The next move has to be so clever, you know, to keep this project alive. So I don't have an easy answer to that. Not at all, but I think it's a great question. And I think, again, it's one of these things of understanding that dilemma. But nonetheless, I think climate change is growing in prominence, and not all firms are bad. And I think it's not so much the small entrepreneur, the local business, it's the corporate structure that would be the first place I'd look to start to reform, if not transform, reform in order to transform. Yeah.
Thank you. Any more questions in the audience here? Otherwise, we have one more in the online. It says, Lydia here from CIDSE. In the face of this ever-increasing climate emergency, we begin to see states and communities become inward-facing or self-centered or indifferent to others, which goes against collective action required by science or real global solidarity that are very much needed by the most affected. How do we restore this?
Wow, that's hard, because it's true. It's certainly happening. But if by inward facing, you're thinking of the rise of nativist populism, there's a strange irony there, and maybe we should play with that. Insofar as right-wing nativist populists are disaffected communities living in Rust Belt communities, the so-called losers of globalization, then they hate liberal elites, they hate cosmopolitanism and so forth. But what they don't like is neoliberal capitalism. And guess what? Nor does the Green Movement. They actually have something in common. That's huge. And it relates back to the previous question. And so I think neoliberalism, it was exposed during the pandemic. We also saw vaccine nationalism, which was bad, but there's a kind of partial deglobalization and a shortening of supply chains for critical industries. But I think there's something there. I think that's, if you think of the post-World War embedded liberalism that John Gerard Ruggie described, and then neoliberalism from the 80s, maybe we'll go back to a more embedded liberalism. And that takes me right back to Karl Polanyi, where the whole problem began with the disembedding of markets. So the answer would be perhaps to re-embed markets, socially and ecologically re-embed markets at a more regional, if not local level, with shorter supply chains that might produce more resilient and less vulnerable economies than we've seen under neoliberal capitalism. And that might then assuage the grievances of the disaffected who might vote for a nativist populist party. And it might actually build some bridges in the way I saw this wonderful development. I've used this as a teaching tool, the Green Tea Party in America. Has anyone heard about it? We all know of the Tea Party, which was a real thorn in the side of Barack Obama in his first term when he was trying to get his healthcare initiative through. Well, in one of the Midwestern states, I forget the name of which, a group of environmentalists were trying to get a renewable energy portfolio through. And the Tea Party was led by this woman called Debbie, who really thought that renewable energy was like her independence. If you didn't have to be beholden to anyone, if you had energy generated from your home. They worked productively with the Sierra Club and a few other environmental groups, called themselves the Green Tea Party. One legislative change got through for a renewable energy portfolio. That's really productive political cooperation. And I can actually imagine, it's not far stretched, to think of those who are inward looking, worried about, because they're more nostalgic, it's a kind of retrotopia, looking back to the post-Fordism, the Fordism of their parents' days, the regular job where you retired with a gold watch after 40 years service, that kind of retrotopia. you can actually build something more durable at a local level in a way where you might be able to work productively with very different people. I grew up in a rural community, so I have a very deep affinity with a lot of those folk, even though I don't agree with them politically. I think it can be done. I can see how it can be done at the local level.
If there are no questions, we'll wrap this up.